I remember staring at the empty seats across from me. 7 chairs, 7 place settings, a centerpiece of dahlias I'd ordered because they'd always been my grandmother's favorite. And thinking that 30 years of trying to be enough for my family had, quietly and completely, come to this. My name is Stella. I turned 30 in October in a private dining room at a restaurant in Vancouver's Yaletown neighborhood, surrounded by my husband Liam's parents and his sister, and 2 of our closest friends, while my own mother, father, and younger brother sat 40 minutes across the city at my brother's kitchen table, toasting to a pregnancy announcement he had decided, out of nowhere, with 48 hours notice, needed to happen on the exact same evening I had spent 4 months planning. I'll be honest with you. When the first excuse started forming, I recognized the shape of it before a single word had even been spoken. I had learned to recognize it a long time ago. Growing up, my younger brother Brett was the kind of person rooms rearranged themselves for. He was funny and loud and magnetic in the way that some people just are from birth, and my parents had loved that about him the way you love a fireplace. Warmly, completely, every face turned toward it without thinking. I was the older one, the one who got good grades without being reminded, who kept her room tidy, who made sensible choices without being asked to. I didn't need much attention, and somewhere along the way my family had quietly taken that as permission to give me very little. I graduated from university without anyone throwing a party. I passed my physiotherapy licensing exam, and my mother said, "I knew you would," as if the whole thing had been obvious and therefore unremarkable. I built a practice, put money away, fell in love with a steady and genuinely good man named Liam, who taught high school history in North Vancouver, and made the best coffee I had ever tasted. My life was full in all the ways that matter. I had just spent so many years watching my family pour their attention into my brother, like water into a crack, that I had stopped expecting any of it to reach me. Brett was 31 by the time of my birthday, with a financial history that would make a chartered accountant need to lie down. He had started a food truck that ended when the vehicle's transmission failed and wasn't insured. He'd launched a small batch coffee roasting company with a childhood friend, which dissolved inside a year when they stopped speaking to each other. His third venture, a tech startup that involved some kind of scheduling app for restaurants, burned through its seed funding in 8 months without producing anything releasable. Each time, my parents rallied around him like a weather system, calling, visiting, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the patient eyes of people who believed absolutely in someone's potential, despite all available evidence to the contrary. Each time, I sat at the edge of those conversations and said supportive things and drove home feeling that particular tired that doesn't go away after sleeping. When Brett's girlfriend Vanessa moved in with him the previous spring, my mother had called me so vibrating with excitement that I had to ask her to slow down. She told me they were looking at buying a house together in Coquitlam. I asked, as gently as I could manage, how they were planning to afford it, given that Brett had been largely unemployed for several months. She laughed and said, "Oh, you know Brett. He always lands on his feet." I did know Brett. That was the part that never quite reassured me. I started planning my 30th birthday in June. I know some people would roll their eyes at that. A birthday is just a birthday. But 30 had started to feel significant in a way I wanted to honor. My 20s had been a decade of building. My career, my marriage, my savings, my sense of who I actually was separate from the family I'd come from. I wanted one evening where all of that got to be acknowledged. I booked a private dining room at a restaurant in Yaletown that I had loved since Liam had taken me there on our 2nd anniversary. I sent the date to my family in a group message in late June. My mother sent back 3 heart emojis. My father replied within minutes to say he had cleared his calendar. Brett said, and I remember this exactly, "Obviously, I'll be there. What kind of question is that?" I confirmed the guest list, chose a tasting menu with the restaurant's event coordinator, ordered the dahlias from a florist my grandmother had used for decades, and arranged for a small cake. I sent a reminder the first week of October. Every single member of my family confirmed again. My mother mentioned she was going to make butter tarts to bring for dessert. I had put this evening together the way I put everything together, carefully, without cutting corners, without assuming anyone else would handle the details. 48 hours before the dinner, Brett called. He told me in a rush, the way he always delivered news he'd been sitting on. Like if he said it fast enough, there'd be less time for anyone to object. Vanessa was pregnant. They'd known for 3 weeks. He wanted to celebrate with the whole family that night, at his place, nothing big, but it had to be that specific evening because Vanessa's parents were visiting from Calgary and were only in town until Sunday morning. I said, Brett, my birthday dinner is on Saturday. He said, I know. But come on, Stell, a baby is kind of bigger than a birthday dinner. I let that sentence sit for a moment. Then I said, very evenly, I've had this booked for 4 months. Liam's parents are taking the ferry over from Victoria. He said, can't you just postpone it? The restaurant would probably rearrange for you. I said congratulations, that I was glad Vanessa was healthy, and that I hoped the visit from her parents went well. Then I ended the call. That evening my mother called. Her voice was careful in the specific way it got. When she was approaching a conversation she knew wasn't going to go her way. She said this was such a special announcement, that Vanessa's parents hadn't met our family yet, that it really was a once-in-a-lifetime moment for Brett, and she hoped I could understand that. I said, Mom, my 30th birthday is also a once-in-a-lifetime moment, by definition. She went very quiet. Then she said they would do a dinner the following weekend, that it would be just as lovely, that I had to understand. I understood, I just didn't agree. My father texted the next morning, 4 sentences. He said he loved me and was proud of me. He said he hoped I had a wonderful evening. He didn't say he was coming. I read it twice and put my phone away. My mother's text arrived at 2:30 on the afternoon of my birthday, while I was getting ready. It said she was sorry. She was thinking of me. She'd call tomorrow. There was a birthday cake emoji at the end. I put my phone face down on the bathroom counter and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment, and then I finished getting ready. Liam was waiting for me in the hallway, in his good jacket. He could read my face the way he could read most things about me. Quickly and without making a performance of it. He said, "They're not coming, are they?" It wasn't really a question. I shook my head. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Let's have the best night anyway." That's the kind of man he is. I have never once taken that for granted. We had a real night, the way that some evenings are real even when they hurt. Liam's parents had driven up and taken the morning ferry from Victoria and arrived with a bottle of BC sparkling wine they'd been saving. His sister had taken the afternoon off work. Our 2 closest friends came from Burnaby with a gift I still have on my shelf. The food was extraordinary. A tasting menu that moved through the best of what the coast offers in October. A halibut course that I would genuinely drive back for tomorrow. I looked at the dahlias and thought about my grandmother, who had moved to Vancouver from small-town Ontario decades earlier and had been one of the most quietly formidable people I have ever known. She had called me sensible the way some grandmothers say beautiful, as if it was the highest word she had. On the way home in the car, I cried a little. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, looking out the window at the city lights on Burrard Inlet, releasing some of the weight I'd been carrying since the week before. Liam didn't say anything. He reached over and put his hand on mine and kept driving. That was enough. We left for Tofino on Sunday morning. I had booked the trip months earlier as a birthday gift to myself. 3 days on the West Coast. The kind of place where the Pacific just arrives at your door and there's very little to do except let it. Liam had been enthusiastic. We loaded the car before 7 and drove up to the island, took the ferry across, wound through the rainforest roads in the gray October morning, and arrived at the property mid-afternoon. I had arranged the stay through a contact I hadn't expected to hear from. A man who introduced himself as the manager of my late grandfather's estate. He had reached out a few weeks before my birthday with a polite, measured email explaining that he managed a trust my grandfather had established, that the trust held a coastal property in Tofino that had never been made available to me during the trustee period, and that in light of my upcoming birthday, he wanted to make sure I had the opportunity to use it. He said the property would be mine to access, however I wished after my 30th birthday. He had arranged our stay as a welcome gift. I had been touched by it in the way that quiet generosities from people who loved your grandfather often touch you, warmly and with a small catch in the throat. I hadn't thought much beyond that. The property was a private cottage on a rocky point overlooking Clayoquot Sound. When we walked in and I saw the view from the main room, the water silver gray in the afternoon light, the old-growth forest pressing down to the shoreline on every side, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full. I stood there for a long moment and felt something in my chest finally, genuinely loosen. We spent 3 days doing very little. We walked on beaches where the sand was the dark Pacific kind, dense and cold. We cooked dinner with things we'd brought from the city. We read and drank wine and stayed up late, talking in a way we hadn't in months, the kind of talking that happens when there's nothing pressing and nowhere to be. By Monday, I had stopped thinking about the empty chairs. On Monday morning, I took a photograph from the deck. Just the view, the sound, the tree line, the pale morning light on the water, the weathered gray railing in the foreground. I posted it on Instagram with a short caption, October Light. I set my phone face down on the railing and went inside to make coffee. 40 minutes later, I came back and picked it up and had 61 missed calls. 61, almost all of them from my mother, with 6 from my father and 3 from a number I didn't recognize. I called my mother back. She answered before the first ring finished. Her voice was not the voice of a woman calling to apologize for missing a birthday dinner. It was the voice of someone in crisis, clipped, fast, trying to control the shape of a conversation she knew she had already lost. She said, "How are you at that property, Stella?" I said, "Hello. That cottage," she said. "You posted a picture. How are you and Liam at that cottage?" I said, "We're on a birthday trip. You knew we were going away this weekend." "Not there," she said. "Not that property specifically." She was breathing unevenly. "How did you get access to it?" "Liam's salary doesn't. That place isn't something you could just book. How did you arrange this?" Something shifted in me. Not quite anger. More like the moment before a door opens, when you can feel the air pressure change on the other side. I said, "Mum, we didn't pay for the cottage. It was arranged through the Pembroke Trust." The silence was complete. When she spoke again, her voice had changed so fundamentally that she sounded like a different person. The sharp, controlling edge had dissolved into something I had never heard from her before, raw, undisguised fear. "What did you say?" she said. I said it again. The Pembroke Trust. My grandfather's estate manager had reached out. He'd said it was the appropriate time. She said very quietly, "That's not possible." "He contacted me a few weeks ago," I said. "He was very helpful." I heard her put the phone down. I could hear her moving quickly through a room, her voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur as she spoke to my father. When she came back, she said she had to go, and she hung up. I stood on the deck in the October morning and looked at the water for a long time. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called my grandfather's estate attorney. I had found his number in a folder of old emails, a message my grandfather had sent me the year before he died, a careful note that had included contact information in case I ever had questions about the arrangements he'd made. I had kept the email without quite knowing why, filed it under a label I never opened. I opened it then. The attorney picked up quickly. When I gave him my full name, his tone shifted in a way that told me he had been expecting exactly this call for some time. He asked me to give him one moment and came back, sounding deliberate and measured the way lawyers sound when the news they're delivering is both serious and significant. He explained the Pembroke Trust, the way you explain something to someone who should have known about it years ago and didn't. My grandfather had established it 22 years earlier, naming my parents as co-trustees with a single mandate: preserve and grow the assets on my behalf until I turned 30, at which point full control transferred to me automatically under the trust's governing terms. The trust held a diversified investment portfolio, the Tofino property, a small commercial unit in Kelowna that generated rental income, and a cash account that, at the time of my grandfather's death, had held just over $400,000. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I genuinely cannot tell you why the floor specifically. It just seemed like the correct physical response to information of that scale. The attorney continued. The transfer of control had been triggered at midnight on my birthday, 3 days earlier. Under the trust's terms, that transfer automatically initiated a mandatory independent audit of every trustee transaction over the preceding 9 years. The audit had already been filed with the BC Supreme Court. He said he was sorry if any of this was coming as a surprise. I asked him what the preliminary findings looked like. He said that based on records his office had already reviewed, there were approximately $265,000 in unexplained outflows from the trust between the year my grandfather died and the present. He said the transactions appeared to have been structured deliberately. Incremental withdrawals over several years, transfers to a numbered company that had subsequently been dissolved, and, more recently, a significant sum used as collateral to secure financing on a residential property purchase in the Lower Mainland. He didn't say the property was in Coquitlam. He didn't need to. I already knew. He said that under the Criminal Code of Canada, the pattern of conduct he was observing constituted prima facie breach of trust by the trustees, and that depending on the findings of the full audit, they could face criminal charges. He said he needed to know how I wanted to proceed. I sat on the kitchen floor of a cottage my grandfather had owned, looking out at the October light on Clayoquot Sound, and I thought about 22 years of careful provision. I thought about an old man who had understood what his family was, who had still loved them, and still quietly built a wall around what was mine, and never said a word to me about it, because he had trusted, somehow, that I would find my way to it when I needed it. I thought about 4 months of planning and a birthday cake emoji and 7 empty chairs and a text message from my mother sent at 2:30 in the afternoon that had included the word sorry without changing a single thing. I told the attorney to proceed with the full audit and to refer the findings to the appropriate authorities as required by law. He said he understood. He said he would be in touch. The calls didn't stop for the rest of the week. My mother called until my voicemail filled up. She left messages that ran the full emotional range. Tearful, then pleading, then bargaining, then tearful again, then something closer to anger before cycling back to tears. She said they had only done what they thought was best for the family. She said my grandfather had never been specific enough about the restrictions on how the money could be used. She said they had always planned to repay everything once my brother was stable. I listened to each message once and did not call back. My father called twice. He didn't leave messages. The silence of that felt like its own kind of admission. My brother called on Tuesday evening. He didn't cry, which I had expected. Brett processes difficulty the way he handles everything else, by reframing it quickly and talking fast and hoping that forward motion will substitute for direction. He said he'd known about the trust in a general way, but hadn't known the specific terms. He said our parents had told him that any financial support they'd provided to him had been cleared with me in advance, that it was an early draw on my inheritance that I had agreed to. He said he had genuinely believed them. I said, Brett, did you ever ask me? At any point in 9 years, did you call me and say, Stella, are you okay with this arrangement? He was quiet. I said, "The restaurant, the startup, the down payment on the Coquitlam house. Where did you think that money was coming from?" He said, "Stella, Vanessa is pregnant. We need that house. Please, you have to understand how much is riding on this for us." I thought about a lot of things in that moment. I thought about the 4 months I'd spent planning a dinner my family hadn't attended. I thought about the phrase, "a baby is kind of bigger than a birthday dinner." I thought about the fact that my grandfather had died 9 years ago believing that what he'd left me would be there when I needed it, and about how much of it had been quietly dismantled in the years since. Then I thought about 61 missed calls and the sound of fear in my mother's voice, and I made my decision. I said, "I'll talk to you when I'm home, Brett." I did not call when I got home. The legal process moved carefully over the months that followed. My parents retained their own lawyer, which I had expected, and submitted a voluntary repayment proposal to avoid criminal prosecution. The court accepted it conditionally on full restitution of $265,000 within 90 days. My father liquidated his entire RRSP and took the early withdrawal penalty, which was significant. It wasn't enough to cover the total. They listed the family home at the end of November. The house where I had grown up, where my mother had spent 2 decades gardening the backyard into something genuinely lovely. And it sold at a loss in January to cover the remainder. My brother and Vanessa's purchase collapsed. The mortgage financing had been partially secured using trust assets as collateral, and when those assets were reclaimed, the deal fell apart. From what I heard, Vanessa's parents, the ones who had been visiting from Calgary the night my family skipped my birthday dinner, had considerable opinions about the situation once they understood the full picture. I felt genuinely sorry for Vanessa in a particular way. She had built her life around someone whose foundations had never actually belonged to him, and she hadn't known any more than I had about where the money was coming from. My parents and I have not spoken since October. I don't know yet what the future of that looks like. I think about my mother's garden sometimes. I think about my father's 4-sentence text. The one that said he was proud of me without saying he was coming. I understand in a rational way that people do terrible things from fear as much as from cruelty, and that my parents had probably told themselves a version of this story in which they were helping one child without truly taking from another. But understanding something is not the same as being ready to forgive it, and I am not going to rush myself toward a peace I haven't genuinely reached just because the alternative is uncomfortable. My brother and I spoke once after everything came out. He apologized in the way that he does most difficult things, circling the actual words with enough context and explanation that by the time the apology arrived, it had traveled a very long way and was a little worn from the journey. I listened to all of it. I told him I heard him. I haven't called since. What I have done is sit down with the attorney 4 times since October. The Pembroke Trust is now fully under my management. The Tofino Cottage, which my parents had been quietly renting to third parties through a property management service and keeping the income, is being renovated. The estate manager told me that my grandfather had always intended it to be a proper home for me someday, that he'd spoken about it in those terms to the people he trusted. The Kelowna Commercials unit is under assessment. The investment portfolio is diminished from what it should have been, but it is recovering. Liam and I are buying a house, a small character home in East Vancouver with original hardwood floors and a backyard that will take years to properly sort out, and a kitchen with east-facing windows that fill the room with morning light. We get the keys in March. Last month, I went back through my phone and found the photo I'd taken from the cottage deck. Clayoquot Sound in the October morning light. The weathered gray railing, the tree line against a pale sky. I looked at it for a long time, thinking about 61 missed calls, and a woman's voice dissolving into fear, and a kitchen floor in Tofino, and an email from my grandfather that I had filed away 9 years ago and never opened. He had known something that the rest of us had spent years pretending not to see. He had been careful the way I had always been careful, and he had built something solid with my name on it, and he had trusted that when I was ready, it would find its way to me. I just hadn't known. The door would open on my 30th birthday, in a cottage kitchen on the edge of the Pacific, with coffee going cold in my hands. And 61 missed calls on a screen I hadn't checked yet. I turned 30 and inherited more than I expected. Not just the property and the portfolio and the restored account balance. I inherited the proof that someone had always seen me clearly, had believed, from the very beginning, that I was worth protecting. Even when the people closest to me had found that harder to manage. That, as it turns out, was the only thing I had ever needed to know. What would you have done in my position? Would you have given your family a chance to explain before calling the attorney, or would you have done exactly what I did? Drop your answer in the comments, and let me know what city you're watching from while you're there.